Today in Random in Psychology, we are going to be talking about research methods and we'll be focusing specifically on experimental research. For those of you who don't know, my name is Liz Wright and I am a professor of psychology at Northwest Vista College in San Antonio, Texas. Every day I do a video where I randomly select a topic from my general psychology textbook. I put in the number of pages into a random number generator and it picks out a page for me. And today it picked page 6. And so page 6 is going over different research methods. And so the topic that I chose, the specific topic that I chose, was looking at experimental versus control groups in our experimental studies. So if you've studied psychology, hopefully you remember that we have multiple different methods or research methods or ways of going about gathering data to support or refute our hypotheses. So we have correlational methods. These methods are going to give us data that cannot indicate cause and effect, but can indicate whether something it might be related. So if we have two variables that we're studying, such as height and shoe size, we may do a survey and find out that the taller people get, the more their shoe size increases, which would be a correlation, actually be a positive correlation because they're moving in the same direction. Um, but does that mean that as I get taller, that causes my feet to grow larger or my shoe size to grow larger? And that's one possible answer, but there's other possible answers as well. So, but we're not talking about correlational studies today. I could go on and talk about research methods for days or hours. So the method we are talking about today is the experimental method. So with an experimental method, our goal is to figure out if a change in a variable produces a change in another variable. So the variable that we are changing is going to be called our independent variable. The variable that we are assessing to look for change or differences is going to be our dependent variable. So the dependent variable depends upon which part or level of the independent variable you were in. And this is where we bring in our experimental versus control group, which is our topic for today. And kind of had to give some background there. So typically, the smallest type of experiment that we can do would be just to have two groups of the independent variable. So we would have a control group and then we would have an experimental group. So let's say that we were doing a research study about how much sleep students got before the AP psychology exam, and we allowed the control group to only sleep for 6 hours, and then the experimental group, we had them sleep for 8 hours prior to the exam. So the independent variable in that situation would be amount of sleep. And the assumption is, or the hypothesis would be, that the more sleep the student got, then the higher their score on the AP psychology exam would be. So the experimental group is going to get what we think of as the experimental treatment, whereas a control group is either going to have no treatment or a different treatment. So another example would be like a medication study. If we were studying which medication was more useful for participants who had ADHD, then we might have a control group that takes a placebo, which would be a sugar pill or a inert substance, something that is not going to cause changes relating to ADHD. And then the experimental group would take the experimental medication, and then we would have some sort of assessment for all of our participants, such as the number of times that they felt overwhelmed in a 48-hour period or something like that. So that would be how we would assess which group did differently. We would take the average number of times that the control group felt overwhelmed and the average number of times that the experimental group felt overwhelmed, and we would see if there was a difference between those two groups. Okay, so today in Random in Psychology, we talked about experimental versus control groups. I will see you tomorrow. We'll talk about something different.